The juveniles arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad day. I say Tuesday because that was how we kept time on Veth Solara Station, the human. Staff did anyway. The Varath administrators used a 17-count cycle that made no sense to my aging brain, and the Korath transit handlers used something involving tidal notation that I had given up trying to parse in my third year. So, Tuesday. The supply run from the lower ring had been shorted by 11 protein pack crates. I had a broken heating coil in Bay 3 that maintenance had been promising to fix for 2 weeks, and one of the Peleth toddlers, a small, round-faced child named Biru, who communicated exclusively in shrieks, had gotten into the conduit access panel again and was currently sitting inside it, refusing to come out. I was on my knees in front of the panel talking Biru through the logic of emerging for lunch when the transit klaxon went off in the corridor outside. That klaxon meant a species-flagged intake, an arrival that the processing desk couldn't immediately classify or route. It happened a few times a month. Usually it was a paperwork problem. Sometimes it was a species the desk hadn't logged before. Occasionally it was something genuinely complicated, got passed to the annex, meaning to me. My name is Marta Osei. I have worked in the children's annex of the Veth Solara Interspecies Transit Shelter for 14 years. Before that I worked in a surface-side creche on the station's lower residential arc, and before that I spent 11 years doing intake processing at a family shelter in the Tethys orbital belt, which was considerably less organized than here. I am 58 years old. I have a bad knee, a habit of carrying too many things in my pockets, and the particular brand of stubbornness that sets in when you've spent enough years doing a job that nobody else wants to do. The annex is not the prestigious part of the shelter. The annex is where they put you when the main facility doesn't have the right classification for you, when you're too young or too small or too unusual, or simply too much of a problem for the standard intake process. We get the hard ones. That suits me fine. I have always preferred the hard ones. I got Biru out of the conduit panel with a promise of the orange protein squares she liked. A promise I'd have to keep even though we were 11 crates short. And I handed her off to Doran, my one part-time colleague, who was 19 and very calm and worth twice what the station paid him. Then I went to the corridor. There were 11 of them. Juveniles, the desk log said. Species Varath. Status unclaimed, unaccompanied, found in a sealed cargo module on a freighter out of the Vethketh transit, or 3rd sector. The freighter crew hadn't known they were there. The module had been registered as empty, filed under miscellaneous freight, and shunted to Veth Solara when the freighter's route ended. How long they'd been in there, nobody knew. I stood in the corridor doorway and looked at them. The oldest was perhaps a year and a half, which I understood to be roughly the age at which Varath juveniles began developing independent thermal regulation, meaning they were past the most dangerous phase but still far from self-sufficient. They ranged down from there in size. The youngest was very small, barely bigger than my forearm, curled in on itself in the way that draconic young do when they are cold or frightened, which looked like someone had folded a piece of deep bronze origami and left it on the floor. They were all bronze, all Varath. The scales ran from a deep reddish bronze in the larger ones to pale copper bronze in the smallest, the color of old coins left in the light. Their eyes, when they opened them, were amber. Every one of them, which I'd later learn was a bloodline marker. They had small stub wings, folded tight against their sides. Not yet strong enough to carry them, but present, veined, catching the corridor light. Claws were tiny and very sharp. Their tails, each tail, was curled in toward their bodies, the tip tucked under like a question mark. Not one of them made a sound. That, more than anything, told me they'd been in that module for a while. Conic juveniles that young are supposed to be loud. They call constantly, a low, vibrating sound that reads as subsonic to most species, but that I can feel in the bones of my hands if I'm close enough. The silence meant they had learned. Somewhere in the dark of that cargo module, that calling didn't bring anyone, that they were better off being quiet. I have been doing this job for 14 years. I know what it looks like when a young creature has learned to stop asking for help. I went back to the annex, got a thermal blanket, and spread it on the floor of Bay 3. The one with the broken heating coil, which meant I had to drag in the portable unit from storage, Took 20 minutes and made my knee ache. I got protein paste and the small warming dishes we used for species that needed their food at a higher temperature. I did the math on how much 11 growing Varath juveniles would eat and then doubled it, because in my experience, young creatures that have gone without always eat more than the estimate. Then I went back to the corridor and crouched down in the doorway so I wasn't looming. I said, in the flat, calm voice I used for all new intakes, that they were welcome to come in if they wanted, and that there was food and it was warm in Bay 3. I did not touch them. I did not reach out. I just left the door open and went back inside and started filling the warming dishes. It took 40 minutes, but they came. First one in was the oldest. A cautious, controlled movement, low to the floor, wings pressed flat, watching me the whole time. I kept my back half-turned and did not look directly at it. It reached one of the warming dishes, dipped its muzzle in, and then went very still. I heard the sound then. So faint I felt it more than heard it. The subsonic vibration of a juvenile Varath eating. It was the first sound any of them had made. The others followed. By the time the last one, the smallest, pale copper one, had crossed the threshold, the oldest was already curled up on the thermal blanket. 3 of its fellows were pressed against it. They moved like water, the way young draconic animals do, flowing into the warmest available space. Within 20 minutes, all 11 of them were on the blanket, in a pile, and the subsonic hum was steady enough that I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. I sat down at my desk, which was in the corner of Bay 3 because the annex had no separate office, and started the intake paperwork. That was the beginning of what I came to think of with considerable affection as the Varath situation. The paperwork was immediately impossible. Varath juveniles did not have individual identification documentation. They had bloodline registers, which were kept by the pack and were not accessible through standard transit databases. The station's classification system had a field for species, Varath confirmed, but no field for pack affiliation, bloodline status, or the 17 other things the Vaseth administrative desk told me were technically required for a complete file. The freighter crew hadn't logged the module properly, which meant the chain of custody was full of holes. The transit authority wanted a next-of-kin claim before they'd authorize me to hold the juveniles in the annex rather than in the general intake ward, which was fine for adults, but ran at temperatures too low for young draconic animals, and smelled, I was told by one of the Vaseth staff, like a place where something had died. I filed 6 different sets of documentation with the transit authority over the first week. I received 3 automated rejections, and 2 requests for information I did not have, and could not get without a pack contact, which I also did not have. The 6th filing I sent with a handwritten note, actual handwritten, on paper, because sometimes the archaic approach cuts through the noise. Explaining the situation in the plainest language I knew, which was the language of someone who had been doing intake work for 25 years, and had a very low tolerance for procedural obstruction. When 11 juvenile animals were sleeping in my bay and eating 3 times their body weight in protein paste every day, the transit authority wrote back and said the file was pending review. I wrote pending review on a piece of paper and put it on my desk so I could when the week got difficult, which was often. In the meantime, 11 Varath juveniles. Their needs were in some ways simpler than the Peleth toddlers. They did not shriek. They did not get into conduit access panels. They did not, as 2 of the older Peleth children had done the previous month, try to eat the communication console on the grounds that it smelled interesting. Varath juveniles were quiet, watchful, and self-contained in the way of animals that have survived something. Careful with their movements, precise about where they place themselves in a room, always positioned with sight lines to the exits. But they ate an extraordinary amount. I had to renegotiate the supply allocation with the station provisioning office 3 times in the first 2 weeks, and by the 3rd renegotiation, I was in the provisioner's office in person, which is always more effective than the form system. The provisioner was a Vaseth elder named Kethvarath Saul, deep slate gray, amber eyes, particular stillness of very old draconic beings, who listened to me describe the situation, and then looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read. He approved the allocation. He also, I noticed, spent an unusual amount of time looking at the requisition form, specifically at the line where I'd listed the quantity consumed per juvenile per day. I didn't think anything of it at the time. There was too much else to do. The heating coil in Bay 3 got fixed in the second week finally, which helped. Portable unit had been loud, and I kept bumping my knee on it in the dark when I came in early. With the coil running properly, the temperature in Bay 3 stabilized into what I'd been told was the Varath juvenile comfort range, and the pile on the thermal blanket spread out slightly. Not much, but enough that I could tell they were more comfortable. The smallest one, the pale copper juvenile, the one I had privately named Peck because of the precise, methodical way it ate, picking through its food as if conducting a quality assessment, began sleeping marginally apart from the group, which I took to mean it was regulating temperature better. I should explain the names. I gave them all working names in the second week. I needed something to put in the daily logs, and I couldn't use bloodline designations I didn't have. I asked the station's xenolinguistics contact if there were any conventional Varath juvenile naming customs I should know about, and she told me that Varath young were named by their pack at a ceremony that occurred after first independent flight, which these 11 hadn't reached yet, and that in the interim they were typically referred to by birth order designations in Varath, that she wasn't certain she could transliterate accurately. So, working names. The oldest was Bracket, because it was always bracketing the others, positioning itself at the edge of the group like a parenthesis. The second oldest was Copper, for obvious reasons. There was Dent, who had a notch in one of its crest ridges that looked like a manufacturing error. There was Low, pressed itself flat to the floor whenever I entered the room, and didn't lift its head until I'd sat down. The most cautious of the lot. There was Thresh, who had the most active tail of any of them, constantly moving in slow circles, even when the juvenile itself was motionless. There was Tallow, a pale amber bronze, who had taken to following me at a distance of about 3 feet whenever I moved around the bay. There was Kink, who had an unusual curve in its neck ridges. There were the 4 I called the batch because they were so close in size and coloring that I couldn't reliably tell them apart from more than 2 meters away. Batch 1, Batch 2, Batch 3, and Batch 4. And there was Peck. 11. Plus, on any given day, between 4 and 9 Peleth toddlers, 2 or 3 Vaseth children awaiting family reunification, and whatever other intakes the week brought. Doran, my part-time colleague, one look at the situation in the second week and started coming in full days without being asked. I did not mention this to him because I suspected he'd be embarrassed about it, and because I needed the help. The Vaseth administrative desk sent me a formal inquiry in the third week, asking for my assessment of the juvenile's condition. I wrote a factual summary. 11 Varath juveniles, apparent ages ranging from approximately 6 weeks to approximately 18 months, presenting as undernourished on intake but responding well to regular feeding and temperature stability. No observed behavioral anomalies beyond the elevated caution consistent with a stressful prior period. I noted that the youngest was small for its apparent age and was eating slightly less than the others. I requested the bloodline registers one more time because without them I couldn't confirm whether the size difference was individual variation or a sign of something I should be monitoring more carefully. The Vaseth desk wrote back and said the bloodline registers were not publicly accessible. I wrote back and said I was aware of that, which was why I was asking them to request access through their own channels, since the juveniles were Varath, and they presumably had interspecies contacts I didn't. They said they would look into it. I added that to the pile with pending review. In the third week, I started reading to them. This was not a policy decision. It was not something I'd done with any previous intake. It happened because I had developed the habit of reading the morning allocation reports aloud to myself as of processing them, because I find that speaking figures makes them sit differently in my mind. And one morning in the third week I looked up from the report and realized that all 11 juveniles had oriented toward me, not looking at me exactly. Their eyes were half-lidded, which, in Varath juveniles, I had come to understand, meant something between relaxed and attentive. Not sleep, not alertness, but the zone between. Their heads were angled in my direction. Tallow, in its standard 3-foot orbit, had stopped moving. I read the rest of the allocation report to them. Then I read the maintenance request log. Then, because I had run out of official documents, and the attention in the room showed no sign of diminishing, I read the technical manual for the Bay 3 heating coil, which I had on file because I'd been trying to diagnose what was wrong with it before maintenance finally came. I read it cover to cover. It was 47 pages of extremely specific technical language about thermal coil installation, specifications for interspecies habitat units, and it was, objectively, one of the least engaging documents I had ever encountered. The 11 juveniles listened to all of it without moving. From that point on, morning reading was part of the routine. I went through the maintenance manual twice. I read the shelter's interspecies intake protocol, all 6 volumes, which took 3 weeks on its own, and which I had honestly been meaning to reread for years because I suspected the volumes had been updated without anyone telling the staff. I read Doran's requisition logs when he left them on the corner of the desk, which he stopped trying to pick up after the 3rd time he caught me mid-sentence. The xenolinguistics contact, when I mentioned this, quiet for a moment, and then said that there was some evidence in the literature that Varath juveniles were attuned to consistent vocal patterns from caregivers, that it was a bonding mechanism, something to do with learning to identify pack members in low visibility conditions. She said it hadn't been studied in depth because opportunities to observe Varath juveniles in care settings were rare. I said that was unfortunate. She said yes, she said. What are you reading to them currently? I said. Volume 4 of the intake protocol. The section on thermal habitat standards. She was quiet again. Then she said, that sounds very calming. I said I thought so too. In the 4th week, something changed. I came in early. I usually came in early, partly because the morning feed was when the juveniles were most active and I liked to be there for it. And partly because the annex was quieter in the mornings before Doran arrived and the Peleth children started in on the day. I came in and found that the thermal blanket formation had shifted. Peck was not in its slightly separate position at the edge. It was in the center. The others were arranged around it in what I can only describe as a deliberate pattern. Bracket on the outside, low on the next ring, the batch filling in the gaps. They weren't just piled together for warmth. They were arrayed around the smallest one in a formation that had, even to my untrained eye, a clear structure. I stood in the doorway for a moment, not moving. Brackett's amber eye opened. It looked at me. It didn't move. I went to my desk, filled the warming dishes, and sat down to do the morning logs as usual. But I watched, and over the following days, what I saw was this. The 11 juveniles had sorted themselves into something. Not a random huddle, an arrangement. When they moved, which was rarely because juvenile Varath are not especially active, they conserve. They moved in relationship to each other in ways that had consistency, that repeated. That meant something I didn't have the context to read, but could feel was there. Brackett was always at the perimeter. Low was always nearest to Peck. Tallow, who followed me at 3 feet, would still detour in a long arc to pass by Peck before coming near me. I mentioned this to the xenolinguistics contact. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that Varath juvenile cohort bonding was not well documented in the literature she had access to. That, she believed, pack-structured behavior in young Varath could appear earlier than previously thought if the cohort experienced significant stress. I asked her what pack-structured behavior looked like. She said she wasn't sure. She said perhaps what I was describing. I wrote to the Vaseth desk again. I said I had reason to believe the juveniles might be demonstrating a pack structure formation and asked whether there was a Varath contact who could advise. I did not hear back for 6 days, and then the reply I received was not from the Vaseth desk, but from someone at the Transit Authority's Interspecies Welfare Division, whose title I fully parse, saying that the file was still pending review and that I should continue standard care protocols. Standard care protocols. 11 Varath juveniles with a functional pack structure and a smallest member who was being guarded around the clock by the second largest, and the answer was standard care protocols. I wrote to the Vaseth desk again. I said I had reason to believe that juveniles might be demonstrating early pack structure formation and asked whether there was a Varath contact who would advise. I did not hear back for 6 days, and then the reply I received was not from the Varath desk, but from someone at the Transit Authority, Interspecies Welfare Division, whose title I couldn't fully parse, saying that the file was still pending review, and that I should continue standard care protocols. Standard care protocols. 11 Varath juveniles with a functional pack structure and a smallest member who was being guarded around, clock by the second largest, and the answer was standard care protocols. I wrote standard care protocols on a piece of paper and put it on my desk next to pending review. And the supply allocation I was still fighting. I also, in the 5th week, started keeping a second log. The official daily log was what the shelter required. Intake status, feeding records, observations, behavioral notes. The second log was for me, in a notebook I kept in the left pocket of my work trousers, and it was less systematic. It was where I wrote things that didn't fit in the official fields. Things like, Thresh's tail makes a different pattern when it's raining. I can't see the rain from Bay 3, but I can see Thresh, and the circular motion slows during rain, and becomes something more like a pendulum. And I've started checking the weather station when I notice the change, and I'm right every time. Things like, the batch have a hierarchy I can now partially read. Batch 3 defers to Batch 2. Batch 1 and Batch 4 are approximately equal. I don't know what the hierarchy is based on. It's not size, they're too close for that. And it's not age for the same reason. But it's there, when food is scarce. Which it hasn't been since the 1st week. But I can tell from how they position at the warming dishes that they have a memory. Scarcity. Batch 1 eats first. Things like, Peck watched me tape the supply requisition envelope closed this morning and then watched the letter, font, outbox, and then looked at the door the mail runner uses for the next 20 minutes. It knows things leave through that door. It's trying to understand the mechanism. I don't know what to do with this observation, but I'm writing it down. Things like, bracket has not in 5 weeks let me within arm's reach without flinching. Today, it did not flinch. I was refilling the warming dish nearest the blanket edge, bracket's position, and it held still. I did not react. Refilled the dish and went back to the desk. But I noted the time, 14:17 station cycle 5th week. The xenolinguistics contact, when I showed her a selection of entries, was quiet for what I had come to recognize as her processing silence. She said, "Can I copy these?" I said yes, if she found them useful. She said she thought they might be more than useful. She said she'd been in contact with a research institution on the lower arc that had a Varath behavioral studies program, and that they had been interested in the case since she'd mentioned it to them, and that they'd like to send someone to observe. I said, when? She said, they'd need to coordinate with the Transit Authority, so it could be weeks. I said, the file is already pending review. Adding an observation request to the pile won't hurt it. She said, with a trace of something that might have been either admiration or exasperation. Marta. Yes, she said. Do you know what you have in Bay 3? I said. 11 Varath juveniles who eat too much protein paste listens to heating-coil installation manuals. I know that, she said. Yes, and I said I didn't have the context she had, and I'd appreciate it if she'd tell me. She said she wasn't certain. She said she'd looked at the consumption records I'd been sending her. The ones I filed with each supply requisition, she'd been copying on the Varath administrative desk as a matter of courtesy, and that the growth rates were unusual. Not wrong, not alarming, unusual in a specific way. She said she'd sent the records to the behavioral studies program and was waiting to hear back. I said, kind of unusual, she said. The kind that sometimes indicates bloodline, I said. The kind that means what, specifically? She said she'd rather wait until she had more information. I wrote bloodline TBC in the notebook in my left pocket. 6 weeks. 6 weeks I had them. 6 weeks of morning feeds and daily logs and renegotiated supply allocations and paperwork that went nowhere, and a xenolinguistics contact who was doing her genuine best, but didn't have the resources I needed, and a transit authority file that sat in the pending bin like a stone at the bottom of a pond. 6 weeks of tallow following me at 3 feet and Peck eating its meals with that precise, methodical focus that I had come to find quietly wonderful, and the batch being indistinguishable until the 6th week when I realized batch 3 Had a slight preference for the warming dish on the left side, which was the only way I could tell it from batch 4. 6 weeks of Brackett, watching me from the edge of the group with amber eyes that were, I suspected, considerably more attentive than they appeared. 6 weeks of Doran coming in full days and never once mentioning it. In the 6th week, the provisioner Keth Varath Saul came to the annex. He didn't send a message first. He simply appeared in the doorway, deep slate gray, very still, amber eyes moving slowly across the bay in a way that I recognized as assessment. He was old enough that his movements had the particular economy of ancient draconic beings, every action deliberate and minimal. The 11 juveniles noticed him immediately. Brackett moved to the perimeter. Low pressed flat. Thresh's tail went still. Was the first time I'd seen it stop moving. I was at my desk. I said good morning and offered him the chair across from my desk, which was technically a visitor chair, but in practice functioned as a shelf for the stack of pending paperwork. He looked at the paperwork on the chair. He looked at the juveniles. He sat down, carefully, because the chair was scaled for humans, not for a being of his proportions, and he said in the extremely precise galactic standard that old Vaseth elders favored, that he had come to assess the situation, personally. I said I appreciated that, and asked if he'd had a chance to reach any Varath contacts about the bloodline registers. He said that the Vaseth administrative desk had forwarded my inquiries to the appropriate channels. I said I was glad to hear it, and that the youngest juvenile was still slightly below the expected weight for its age. Chai. Remained uncertain was individual variation, or something I should be monitoring more closely, and that having bloodline information would help me assess that. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the juveniles again. Peck had emerged from the morning pile and was working its way through its food with characteristic precision. Tallow was in its standard position, 3 feet from my left elbow. Low had lifted its head, which it rarely did when there was an unfamiliar being in the room. Keth Varath Saul watched all of this for what I estimated was 4 minutes, in silence. He was very still in the way that old Vaseth elders are still. Not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of someone who has learned that the world reveals itself if you give it enough quiet. His amber eyes moved from Brackett to Peck to Tallow to me and back again, and once his gaze crossed to the morning log on my desk, and stayed there for a count of 3, reading the column headings. Then he said, in the same precise tone, that he would ensure my inquiries received more direct attention. He left without saying anything else. That evening, stayed late for the first time. He didn't explain why. He did the 1400 and the 1800 checks, the two we usually split, tween us, and at 2000, when I was finishing the daily log, he came to the desk and said he'd been thinking. I said, about what? He said, the formation, the way they sleep. He said he'd been watching it for a week, and he thought the pattern wasn't random, and he'd been trying to map it. He put a piece of paper on my desk. It was a hand-drawn diagram of the thermal blanket, circles for each juvenile, labeled with the working names, with arrows indicating what he'd observed of their movements and relative positions over the past several days. I looked at the diagram for a long time. I said, that's not a pile, that's a formation with a center. He said, yes, he said, Peck is always the center. The others arrange outward from it, but the arrangement isn't fixed, it rotates. Brackett holds the outside. Low holds the inside ring nearest Peck. But the others cycle through intermediate positions, he said. It's like a watch rotation, I said. You're saying they're doing shifts, he said. I think so. I can't be sure. Kink was in the inner ring last night, and Copper was in the inner ring the night before, and they weren't there at the same time. Looked at the diagram. I thought about what the xenolinguistics contact had said about bloodline. I thought about Brackett at 1417, holding still. I said keep noting it. He said he would. He went home. I sat at the desk for another hour, reading the diagram and thinking about 11 very young animals in a cargo module in the dark, learning to be quiet, and about the kind of order they had built in Bay 3, out of thermal blankets, protein paste, and whatever they already were. Then, I filed the diagram in the second notebook and went to start the 2200 check. I thought about that visit for a long time afterward, without knowing why. On the 40th day, I had stopped counting in Tuesdays by then and had switched to days, because the situation had acquired a kind of momentum that made weeks feel like the wrong unit. The Transit Authority file was transferred, transferred, to a different desk with a different classification that the Transit Authority's covering note described as more appropriate to the nature of the matter. I did not know what that meant. I filed the transfer notification in the appropriate folder and went back to the morning feed. On the 41st day, I came in early as usual. Bay 3 was quiet. The juveniles were in their morning configuration, Peck in the center, the others arranged outward. The heating coil was running well. The light through the clerestory windows was the pale early station light that preceded the main solar cycle, flat and clean and cool. I was filling the warming dishes when Doran came in, earlier than usual, still wearing his jacket. He stood in the doorway of the bay and said, in a tone that I had not previously heard from him, that there was something happening at the intake corridor. I asked him what kind of something. He said a lot of something. He said, like a lot, down the warming dish and went to the corridor. There were 30 of them. Varath. Full adults, not ancient but fully grown, which meant they were considerably larger than anything I was accustomed to dealing with in the annex. They filled the intake corridor from wall to wall and extended back around the curve toward the main intake hall, which meant there were more of them than I could see. Their scales were deep bronze and copper and reddish amber, Varath coloring, but darker and denser than the juveniles, the way old metal is different from new. Their wings were folded but present, the leading edges showing the scarring and reinforced keratinous plating of mature draconic adults. Their eyes were amber, every one of them, and they were all looking at me. The one at the front was the largest. It stood, and I say stood with the full weight of what that meant, because this was a being that when it straightened to its full height would have the top of its head at the level of the ceiling junction, with a stillness that was not the stillness of animals, or even of very old beings. It was the stillness of something that had been moving very fast for a long time and had just stopped. Its scales were deep bronze red, the darkest in the group. There was a long scar along its left shoulder that had healed pale, the color of raw copper. I should note for context that I am 5 feet 3 inches tall. I weigh on a good day 140 pounds. I was wearing my work clothes, gray and practical, and have many pockets. And I was holding, in my right hand, a warming dish full of protein paste, because I had not put it down before coming to the corridor. I looked at 30 adult Varath dragons in an intake corridor, and thought that someone probably should have warned me. I also thought, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in moments of considerable strangeness, that the corridor was going to need to be logged as a temporary holding space, which was a different form than the intake form, and which, I was fairly sure, I had not filled out in years. The large one at the front lowered its head. Not all the way, it didn't press to the floor, it didn't bow. It wasn't a display of submission, but enough that its amber eyes were approximately level with mine. It said something in Varath. The sound of it was low enough that I felt it before I heard it, a vibration in my sternum, in the bones of my hands. I did not speak Varath, mostly from the xenolinguistics contact, mostly vocabulary that was useful for the juveniles. Food, sleep, good, stay. The word it said was not any of those. I said in Galactic Standard that I was the annex supervisor and that this was the children's annex, and that I didn't have an appointment for a group this size in the system, which meant processing was going to take a while if they'd all come to make a claim. The large one looked at me. I said that if they'd sent documentation ahead, bloodline registers, lineage verification, anything of that kind, it would help considerably, and that I'd been requesting that documentation for 6 weeks. So if they had it, I would be very glad to receive it. The large one continued to look at me. One of the others, slightly smaller, with a notch in its left crest ridge that made me think, absurdly, Dent, said something brief in Varath that the large one did not respond to. Another one, deeper in the group, said something else. A third replied. Brief, controlled. The kind of exchange that has a structure I couldn't parse but could feel was not argument. It was something more like protocol. I said I was going to go back inside and finish the morning feed, and that if someone could identify a point of contact with Galactic Standard who could help me process the claim documentation, I would appreciate it. And they were welcome to wait in the corridor or in the main intake hall, which had seating, rated for larger species. Then I went back to Bay 3. I am not as a rule a person who explains herself. I have found over 25 years of intake work that calm and proceeding as normal is almost always more effective than explaining, and that most difficult situations in shelter work, and I have had a great many difficult situations in shelter work, are made worse, not better, by stopping in the middle of them to explain what you're doing. You do the thing. The doing is the explanation. So I went back to the warming dishes, finished filling them. I set them in their places. The juveniles were awake. Brackett was at the perimeter, as always, watching the door with amber eyes. But none of them had moved from the formation. Tallow was not at its usual 3-foot distance. It was pressed against Low, which it had not done since the first week. I sat down at my desk and opened the daily log. I had written 2 lines when Doran appeared in the doorway. He said, very quietly, that all 30 of them were in the corridor. I said that was fine. He said they weren't moving. I said that was also fine. He said some of them were looking at the bay window. I looked up at the bay window. It was a standard annex window, set at human eye level in the corridor wall, designed to let staff check on intakes without entering. Through the glass I could see, very clearly, a portion of what I could only describe as a wall of bronze. Scales pressed close. Several pairs of amber eyes. I looked at those eyes for a moment. Then I looked at the juveniles. Brackett had not moved from the perimeter, but its head was turned toward the window. Its amber eyes were fixed on the glass with an intensity that I had not seen from it before. Not the watchful, cautious attention it usually directed at me or at the door, but something different, something pulled taut. Thresh's tail had stopped moving. Peck, small, pale copper Peck, who ate with methodical precision and slept in the center and was guarded by the others, had lifted its head from the warming dish and was looking at the window with amber eyes that were, in that moment, exactly the same eyes I could see through the glass. Down my pen, I said, to no one in particular, that I supposed we should sort this out. I went to the corridor door. The 30 adults were still there, still filling the space from wall to wall. The large one was in the same position, head slightly lowered, amber eyes at my level. It had not moved. I said that if they had come to claim the 11 juveniles in Bay 3, I needed to verify identification and complete the release paperwork, and that the process would go faster with a galactic standard interpreter. I said that while we sorted that out, they were welcome to come to the bay window, and I would not stop them looking through it, but I couldn't admit the full group to the bay, because it was a care space, and my first obligation was to the juveniles' welfare. 30 adult draconic beings in a space designed for children was not a configuration I was going to authorize, without knowing everyone was settled first. Then, because this felt like the right moment for a practical offer, I said that, if any of them wanted protein paste, I could bring more warming dishes, though I'd need to requisition additional supply, and that would take about 20 minutes. The large one looked at me for a long, still moment. Then it made a sound, low, brief, felt more than heard, and the group shifted, organized. They moved to the corridor wall, pulling back from the doorway in a smooth, coordinated way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of a military maneuver, except that it ended with them all arranged along the wall, with the large one directly across from the bay window, looking through the glass, and the others arranged outward from it. I went back to Bay 3. The juveniles were watching the window, all of them. Even Low, who never fully lifted its head in the presence of unfamiliar beings, had its head up. Tallow had moved from its position against Low and was standing, actually standing, not lying, at the full juvenile height it was capable of, which was not very much but was more than I'd seen it do indoors before. Through the window, I could see the large Varath adult looking in. I stood to one side and let them look at each other. What happened in the next several minutes is hard to describe, because most of it was not visible to me. It was subsonic, I think, a frequency exchange that I could feel in the soles of my feet and the back of my jaw but couldn't hear or translate. The juveniles were still. The large one through the window was still, but something moved between them, through the glass, through the wall, some current of communication that I was standing adjacent to without being part of. It went on for what I estimated was 8 minutes. Then the large one lifted its head from the window. It looked at me through the glass, directly at me with amber eyes that were very steady. It held that look for a count of 5. Then it moved aside. The others came to the window. One by one, in an order that had the same deliberate structure I'd seen in the juveniles formation. Each one looked through the glass. Each one stayed for a different amount of time. Some very brief, some longer. The one with the notched crest ridge, the one that reminded me of Dent, stayed the longest. I watched from the side and did not interrupt. When the last of the 30 had been to the window, the large one came back to the corridor doorway. I met it there. It lowered its head until its amber eyes were level with mine again. Then it said something in Varath, not the single word from before, but a longer phrase, careful and deliberate, as if it was choosing each sound with precision. I said, honestly, that I didn't have the vocabulary for that and I was sorry. It looked at me. Then it looked over my shoulder, into the bay, at the 11 juveniles who were all watching from their positions. Then it looked at the warming dish I had set down in the doorway, the one from the morning feed, still half full of protein paste, the one I'd been carrying when I came to the corridor the first time, and had put down without thinking when I went back inside. It looked at the dish for a moment, then it looked at me, I said, because it seemed like the practical next step, and because the silence was starting to feel like it was waiting for something, that I was going to get the interpreter from the transit office, and that while I did that, if they wanted to bring the large one inside to see the juveniles properly, I thought we could manage that. Just the one, in the bay, with me present, if they thought that was appropriate. I said I'd need to move the paperwork chair. The large one made a sound that was. And I hold to this assessment even now because I know what I heard. A very short, very quiet sound that was, in the particular register of something enormous trying to produce something small, a laugh. Not a human laugh, but the cognate thing, the equivalent beat. I looked at it. It looked at me. I went to get the interpreter. The interpreter was a young Varath staff member named Dara Kethsol, who had, when I found her in the transit office, already been briefed on the situation and was waiting for me with a data tablet. And the expression of someone who had been told to be ready for something significant and was attempting to rise to that. She came back to the annex with me. She looked at the 30 Varath adults filling the corridor, swallowed once, and then composed her face into professional calm, which I respected. She spoke to the large one in Varath. The conversation was brief. Then she turned to me and said, in a voice that was keeping very careful hold of itself, that the being in front of us was Veth-Karath Varath, war captain of the Varath 6th Pack. I said that was good. It meant I had a name to put in the file. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then she said that the Varath 6th Pack was one of the oldest bloodline packs in the Varath conclave, and that Veth-Karath Varath had been searching for the 11 juveniles for 6 weeks across 3 transit sectors, and that the 11 juveniles were, she checked her tablet, bloodline-bonded heirs of the pack's 11 senior war captains. I looked at the 11 juveniles on the thermal blanket. At Brackett, who had never stopped watching the edges. At Low, who had spent 6 weeks pressing itself flat at any unfamiliar presence. At Peck, ate with methodical precision and was guarded in sleep by 10 others. I said after a moment that I wished someone had put that in the intake paperwork 6 weeks ago because it would have saved a considerable amount of supply negotiation. Dara Kethsol looked at me. Then she turned back to Veth-Karath Varath and said something in Varath. The war captain listened. Its head turned from her to me. Its amber eyes were very steady. Then it said something back. Dara Kethsol looked at her tablet, then at me, then at the floor, briefly as if organizing herself, she said, Veth-Karath Varath asks me to tell you that the Varath 6th Pack has a question for you. I said I was happy to answer if I could. She said, in the 6 weeks you held the 11 heirs, how many mornings did you miss the feeding? I said, none. She relayed this. There was a brief exchange in Varath. She said, Karath Varath asks whether any of the 11 were harmed in your care. I said, no. The youngest was slightly below weight on intake, and is still on the lower end of the range but recovering. I've been monitoring that. If there's a bloodline physician who can advise, I'd welcome it. She relayed this. Longer exchange, she said. The war captain asked was still asking for documentation when the pack is standing in your corridor. I said, because documentation protects the juveniles. If I release them without proper verification and something goes wrong, there's no record of what happened and no recourse. The paperwork isn't for me, it's for them, she relayed this. The corridor was very quiet. Varath lowered its head. Lower than before, the full extended movement that I had not seen it make yet. Head coming down until it was below level of my shoulder. The massive bronze-red neck, curved and still. It held that position. Thin. I stood in the doorway and looked at the top of a Varath war captain's head. Was not something I had expected to be doing this Tuesday. It was Tuesday again by then. I'd recalculated. And thought that this was probably significant in some way I didn't have the full context for. I said to Dara Kethsol that we should get the paperwork sorted, and that I'd need the bloodline registers and verification documentation, and that once that was in order the release process should take about 40 minutes. She looked at me, she said, in a voice that was now not keeping hold of itself particularly well. The war captain has paid you the full acknowledgement. That is, it's the gesture a Varath war captain makes to another war captain, to an equal. I looked at the top of Varath's head. I said that I appreciated that, and that the paperwork still needed to be sorted, and that once it was I would make sure all 11 were medically cleared before release. The war captain lifted its head. Its amber eyes met mine. The very short, very quiet sound happened again. The one I had filed under the cognate of a laugh. And this time it was audible enough that Dara Kethsol glanced at it quickly. Then Varath said something. Dara Kethsol listened, looked at her tablet, and then, in a careful voice, translated. The 6th pack will supply the documentation. And the war captain asks to say this in 6 weeks. 11 heirs of 6 weeks to 18 months, with no information and no support, and a desk that gave her pending review. She lost none of them. The 6th pack acknowledges this. We do not have a word in Galactic Standard for what we mean, but the war captain asks me to say that what she did is the kind of thing we name. I said I appreciated that. I said the provisioner Kethvarathsol had also been helpful, and that Doran, my part-time colleague who had been coming in full days without being asked, deserved to be noted in any record they kept, because he'd done half the night checks for the last 4 weeks. Dara Kethsol translated this. There was a pause. Varath said something very brief. Dara Kethsol said, the war cap says, of course she mentioned someone else first. Went to find Doran to tell him he was being put in the record. He was in Bay 3. He had at some point in the last hour additional warming dishes from the storage room and refilled all of them. All 11. And then the 2 spares we kept on the shelf. So there were 13 in a row, which was more than we needed, but which did not look like excess given the circumstances. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, which was not regulation but was something I had told him was fine as long as the work was done, and Tallow was 3 feet away from him, which was Tallow's standard comfort distance, and Low was slightly less than 3 feet from Tallow, which was a distance I hadn't seen Low maintain with anyone except Peck. He looked up at me. He said carefully, "Is it sorted?" I said it was being sorted. I said his name was going in the record. He said, "What record?" I said, "The Varath 6-pack record. Whatever that is." He looked at me for a moment. Okay. I said, "Keep the warming dishes full," he said. I was going to anyway. I went back to the corridor. It took 2 hours, not 40 minutes. Because the bloodline registers were in a format that Dara Kethsol had to translate field by field, and because 2 of the 11 had their lineage documented under names that didn't match the transit authority's system and required supplementary verification, and because at one point the transit authority's desk put the file on hold for 17 minutes for reasons that were not explained, and that I addressed with a phone call that I kept very level and very clear. But it was sorted. All 11 released. All 11 medically cleared, including Peck, whom I walked through the corridors to the main intake hall where the pack was assembling, because Peck was still the smallest, and still on the lower end of the range, and I wanted to make sure it reached its destination and didn't get lost. In the press of 30 adult bodies, the pack moved aside for us, all 30 of them, a corridor wide enough to walk through, directly to Varath. The war captain lowered its head when I brought Peck forward. The small, pale copper juvenile stood in front of it for a moment. Then it made the subsonic sound, the vibrating hum I'd been feeling through my shoes for 6 weeks, and stepped forward under the war captain's jaw and pressed close. I stood and watched. The war captain looked at me over the top of Peck's small, pale copper head. I said goodbye to Peck, which I had been told by the xenolinguistics contact. The juvenile probably couldn't process as a distinct utterance, but which felt like the right thing to say. Then I said goodbye to Bracket and Low and Tallow and Thresh and Dent and Kink and Copper and the 4 batch juveniles in order, because they were all lined up along the near wall watching me, and they deserved to be named even if the names were working, names I'd made up from a warming dish and a tail's habit of moving in circles and a notch in a crest ridge. The last one I said goodbye to was Bracket. It was, as always, at the edge of the group, watching the perimeter. It looked at me with amber eyes that had been watching me every morning for 6 weeks, and it held that look for a moment longer than the others had. Then it turned and walked to the pack. I went back to Bay 3. Doran had cleaned up the warming dishes. The thermal blanket was folded. The portable heating unit from the first week was back in the corner, where I'd stored it when the coil was fixed, and it was clean, which meant he'd cleaned it at some point without being asked. It was Doran entirely. He was at my desk, not in my chair, but standing at the corner of it, reading the daily log I'd been keeping on the 11. He looked up when I came in. I said, "All out." He said, "I know." I watched from the window. He handed me the log. He said, "The batch ones are listed as batch 1 through 4 in the file. Transit Authority is going to want actual designations," I said. "The pack will have them now. We can request them for the record." He nodded. He said, "The weight record for the small one, is that going to flag anything in the medical follow-up system?" I said I'd flag it manually, on the release form so the pack physician would see it. He said, "Good." He picked up his jacket from the visit chair, the one that functioned as a shelf for pending paperwork, which was now, I noticed, sorted into a neat stack, and moved to the corner, which meant he'd done that sometime in the last 2 hours, without interrupting anything. He said he'd see me Thursday. I said Thursday. He left. I sat down at my desk. I opened the daily log and wrote the closing entry for the 11, all released, all medically cleared, transferred to Varath 6th pack, under documented bloodline verification. File closed pending final administrative confirmation. I noted Doran's name in the record as contributing staff. I noted the provisioner Keth Varathsol as having facilitated the supply allocation that made 6 weeks of proper feeding possible. Then I looked at the pending paperwork in the corner and thought about the 7 Peleth toddlers who would be in on Thursday, and the 2 Vaseth children who were still awaiting family reunification, and the supply allocation I needed to renegotiate because the 11 Varath juveniles had been, even by generous standards, a significant draw on the protein paste budget. Outside through the clerestory window, the main solar cycle had come on, the bright, flat station light that passed for midday on Veth Solara. It came through the glass and fell across the thermal blanket, was folded and empty on the floor of Bay 3, and across the 11 warming dishes, stacked in their clean row along the shelf. I wrote the supply requisition. I noted at the bottom of the requisition form, because the provisioner Keth Varathsol was the kind of being who read the forms carefully, that I appreciated his intervention in the allocation negotiations 6 weeks ago, and that it had made a material difference to the outcomes in Bay 3. I said this plainly, without embellishment, because that was how I said things, and because I thought he would prefer that to anything ornate. Then I sent the form and started on the next file in the stack. It was a Tuesday. There was work to do.